Kaya, I'm gonna make you a co-host as well, as I did with Alba, and we're waiting to see Elijah joining us. Tony's here. We'll give, what's happened with the pandemic is that we get many more people just literally showing up within the couple of minutes, around the hour. The world has changed. Yeah, welcome to all of you. Like always, good morning, Orion.
Good morning.
Oh, and our next speaker is here to do his, maybe he wants to do his own PR of the upcoming talk, Filippo. Adriana, I'm going to make you co-host as well.
Thank you, Eduardo. Hi, everyone.
And we're still missing, I need to keep an eye on my email in case Elijah is having trouble. Are we live? I mean, can somebody confirm that we're okay in YouTube?
Let me check.
YouTube is on, I just checked, yeah.
It is okay? We're live, Maren?
Yes.
Thank you. And I don't see Elijah. I hope he's an hour earlier. I hope he's not confused.
I'm here, Eduardo.
Oh, there you are. Good morning. I'll
Good
make you
morning.
co-host as well. And being already 11:01, I suggest we get started. We have some new faces today, so I think it's worth taking a couple minutes to welcome you all to a new and rather different fine seminar meeting. It's one that has been cooking in my mind for quite a few semesters, following the requests and suggestions of many of you. And finally, we had this empty slot, which is also, I mean, we're kind of in a fall break here at Yale, so this is a slower week for my regular responsibilities, so it was a good time to schedule this meeting. Before we tell you what the plans are for today, like we always do, let me share my screen and remind you of the fantastic talk that we will have. So can you see my screen? Is it coming up well? So next week, we're going to be hearing from Filippo Aureli, who is also joining us today from the Universidad Veracruzana. Filippo has been doing research on fission-fusion societies, particularly in Mexico, on spider monkeys. So I invite you to join us next week. And like we do always, please feel free to circulate and share the fine announcement within your community. Everyone is welcome. You can also email me if you want me to include you in the participants list. We are now, I mean, really, the announcements of the talks are going to almost 700 people. And many of those people learning are watching the recorded presentations after, because people have gone back to more of their regular lives and they cannot always attend in person. So that's for announcing our meeting next week. Today, like I said, we have a somewhat different meeting. It is indirectly related to social evolution because what we have is a conversation about scientific and statistical inference in the study of social evolution. I'll briefly introduce you to my younger colleagues who will just be sharing with you a few thoughts. We have made the commitment that we're not going to take more than 5 minutes each on sharing those thoughts, because again, different from all other fine meetings, we just want to open it up to the floor and have a conversation and discussion. After I make very brief remarks, Kaya Tombak will share some of her thoughts. She's a junior fellow at the City University of New York in the USA. And then Elijah will follow her. Elijah is a PhD MPH student in anthropology and epidemiology. So Elijah brings to the conversation a little bit of exposure and background on epidemiology. And then Alba Garcia de la Chica brings also a perspective from psychology, later informed by field biology. She's currently a postdoc in the Institute of Ecology, Genetics, and Evolution at the University of Buenos Aires. So that's those are their names and their backgrounds, and they'll be sharing with you some thoughts on why they were interested in this meeting. Myself, oh, and I want to introduce as well very quickly, because the meeting today was somewhat informed by my conversations with Valentin Amrhein, one of the authors that we suggested you read. Valentin is joining us today. He's at the University of Basel in Switzerland, and he's really been very, very committed to the ideas that we want to present to you and discuss with you. So it's great that we have Valentin here as well. We also have Claudia Valegia, my colleague and wife, with whom we wrote the commentary that we share with you, and with whom I share also some of the interests and concerns regarding the balance between statistical inference and scientific inference. So it's 11:05. I will not go further than 11:10 with my own specific comments. Let me just, I didn't know what to say, honestly, because there's so much or so little I could say. I needed us, how do I go to presenters mode? I haven't done this for a while. Let me see. I always struggle with the banner. There we go. Yes, so you see that. So the first thing I wanted to show you is be straightforward and open, that we'll need to be humble. We'll need to be modest. We'll need to be able to accept that maybe we want to change how we did things in the past. So these are tables that I would rather not publish again, but this is my own work. So there's no shortage of the things that I'm trying not to do anymore. These are papers on pair bonding and affiliative interactions between titty monkeys in captivity, observational research, very limited number of subjects, all kinds of reasons why.
Eduardo,
Yes?
before interrupting, but we're seeing your notes. It's very difficult for us to see the tables because they're smaller. So can you?
Oh, okay, no, but okay, so thanks. That is because in one screen that I'm looking at, I'm seeing, let me see if we just go with that. I mean, really, the visuals are not that important. The point is that I've done it, right? I mean, we have all focused our attention on statistical significance. That's what we're trying to change. But also at around the same time, these are papers from when I was a grad student. When I was also a grad student, I published my first paper calling attention to alternatives to significance testing. So it's amazing that it's been 25 years. I'm delighted to see that finally, I think the tide is changing. I think that there's a change in motion, and it's here to stay once and for all. What is it that we want to discuss with you? What is it that we want to share evidence about? It's what Valentin and Sander Greenland so beautifully summarized in the Nature commentary. I mean, let's read it together. We're not calling for a ban on p-values, nor are we saying they cannot be used as a decision criterion in certain specialized applications, such as determining whether manufacturing process meets some quality control standard. Applications that do not relate to 99.9% of the research we all do. And we're also not advocating for an anything goes situation in which weak evidence somehow becomes credible. Rather, and in line with many others over the decades, we're calling for a stop to the use of p-values in the conventional dichotomous way to decide whether a result refutes or supports a scientific hypothesis. We're calling for us to begin using more of our scientific thinking and less the arbitrary dichotomous statistical significance to determine the value of our research. I will stop with just one quote that I love from one of my colleagues. Richard Smith has been publishing about the topic in biological anthropology, and he opens one of the sections in the paper saying, many researchers misunderstand statistics. They think that it answers questions. Students misunderstand statistics. Researchers misunderstand statistics. statistics do not answer questions. At least they don't answer the questions that we are interested in as biologists, environmental scientists, epidemiologists. Those kind of questions need statistics. We cannot get the best possible answer without statistics, but it requires so much more than statistics. With that, I'll stop and I'll stop sharing and invite Kaya to share with you some of her own thoughts and ideas for our meeting today.
Hi, so I'm going to just give you a quick blurb about my path through statistics, because I actually think it's quite typical of many of us here. My training is mostly from biology and anthropology departments. And I think a lot of us went through a similar path. So in undergrad, I took a basic statistics course, and it was really just a surface level, but also not, philosophy heavy. So we were taught about, when to do a t-test, when you do a Wilcoxon test. We often had these sort of decision trees that we would follow depending on what the data looked like. And they didn't really go too much into the philosophy of it. And when they did touch on it, it was quite vague or obtuse. So we just kind of stuck with our decision trees and tried to get through it. And then when I got my own data, it did not work in practice. So I did my master's on red colobus monkeys, and my data have always been, observational, behavioral data, or at least there's been a component of it throughout my work. So often you don't get really strong effect sizes, and I'd get really frustrated with my results. If I was using the p-value, the results would flip back and forth between yes or no, or effect or no effect, depending on tiny little adjustments, if I collected a bit more data or analyzed a subset of interest or whatever. And I felt like I was constantly recrafting the story depending on this p-value. And I thought it was my fault. I thought I just didn't understand. If only I read more statistics books, I'd really be able to get this. If I could look under the hood of what's going on with these commands, then maybe I can understand why this kept happening. And another thing was that whether my data met the assumptions enough was a constant anxiety, because you're never going to have, a perfect data set for a cookie cutter test. And so I always felt like, I was kind of just hand waving this part away, and it felt bad. And so I tried learning about more and more different stats tests. Oh, maybe I just need to learn how to do a hurdle GLM or whatever, this or that. And finally I got a really good advice from a reviewer on a paper. And this was on the red colobus monkey data. And they suggested I learn to do an information theoretic AIC modeling approach, which was a nice step away from this sort of approach. And it allowed for the weighting of different potential models that fit the data. And then when there's lots of models that fit the data pretty well, you can average the results across those models. And it was kind of a nice way to take control and to be sort of more transparent about the decisions you're making before you present your results. So that was great. And then during my PhD, I did start learning Bayesian statistics, and I went through this workshop series. We used McElrath's statistical rethinking, which is fantastic. It was such a good, he's a really good teacher, and his YouTube videos that go along with it are really amazing. I'm still trying to learn how to do, my own models, design my own Bayesian models and run them myself. But in the meantime, I have been collaborating with people that do know how to do that. And that has really changed how I've approached things. And so, yeah, I mean, I still do some, p-value related stuff, but I talk about the effect size more, and I make the inferences more nuanced. And I'm excited to keep learning about Bayesian and to try to be able to implement them myself. someday. So that's my path. And I'm gonna pass it on to Elijah.
Thank you, Kaya.
Give me a second, Elijah. Kaya, can you remind me? So when I'm just trying to give the audience a sense of how much you relate to many of our participants today. When did you get your PhD?
I graduated in 2019.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So just to remind you again, I'm a PhD student in biological anthropology, also doing my master's in epidemiology. And as Eduardo kind of hinted, I'm a little bit removed from studying social evolution. I actually study socioeconomic status and how this relates to health across the life course among humans. But I think Eduardo invited me to speak today to kind of open the floor for other students to speak and share some of my perspectives. Since, as he mentioned, this paper from Valentin, shifting from significance testing to estimation, I think I've had kind of a unique perspective on how anthropology and evolutionary biology on one hand, and epidemiology on the other, the two fields that I'm training in, are kind of at different points in these debates. So in my epidemiology training, I've seen at the introductory level, for example, these ideas are discussed in chapter 1 of our new textbooks, directly talking about the debate of significance testing and estimation, and what is causality, what is causal and scientific inference, why can predictive models sometimes not give us the right inferences for interventions? And this is really important. As you would expect for epidemiologists, the stakes are a little bit higher because if we get it wrong, it can impact people's health and potentially their life expectancy. Kind of on the flip side of my training in anthropology, a lot of times our quantitative methods training is outsourced, often by necessity. At least in American anthropology, we're often in 4 field departments with cultural anthropologists, archaeologists, and might not have the departmental bandwidth to do in-house quantitative methods training. But by outsourcing just the statistics departments, for example, chapter 1 of statistics books are, what is a variable? What is a distribution? What is a correlation? It's not what is a scientific research question. What is study design? What is biases that come up with observational data? And so I've, as you know, I'm going through graduate school and thinking about the science I want to do. Kind of being between these two fields has given me, I think, a unique perspective, because I can go to anthropology conferences and epidemiology conferences and see sometimes we're asking the same exact questions, but using diverging approaches. And then when I talk to my student peers in anthropology, they're often echoing what Kaya said. If only I had more statistics training, if I could knew a different type of statistical test, maybe I could be more confident. And I always try to really reinforce the idea that I think that it's got to be scientific thinking first, then statistical inference. And then trying to develop these ideas outside of our statistics courses might be the way we can integrate these in our fields. But I have a lot more thoughts on things and other ideas to talk about that things that I've came across as a student, but I'll save that for later. And I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say about these topics.
Thank you, Elijah. Alba, you're next.
Yes, hello. Hello, Alba de la Chica. Eduardo briefly introduced me before, but I'm a postdoc, a student in University of Buenos Aires. And I have kind of like the exact same path as Kaya told us with statistics, but Eduardo was my advisor during my PhD. So I've been immersed in this literature against the dichotomic thinking, or the use of indiscriminately use of statistics sometimes. And even when I have the background about all the problems associated with this use of statistics, I find myself sometimes that I need to do certain things in order to publish, to get a job, that don't combine with this previous thinking. For example, reviewers asking us for like certain our methods, or trying to justify, you present your raw data, but then you also need to present a p-value to justify why you are including this raw data. So I find myself trying to balance this knowledge that I have on statistics with also what I need to do in order to like publish my work. So that's what I would like to talk to you a little bit more later. Like, okay, what can we do? Like when I say we, is as postdocs or graduate students, and what can they, like senior PIs or editors, reviewers, what can they do in order to try to balance this statistical and scientific thinking in our publications? I can go further with solutions, but maybe it's gonna be better if we discuss a little bit and then we start talking about.
Thank you, Alba. Thank you, all three of you. I think you bring, like you just summarized, wonderful various backgrounds to the issues that I'm sure many people in the audience relate to. To just comment quickly on one of, because Alba talked last, I think that those of you young, getting started, sometimes overestimate how much those reviewers may know about things that you as grad students and postdocs are reading so much more. Those working with me know that I have no problems in admitting that I'm going these days to Alba to understand how to build a model, etc. Unfortunately, that's the state of affairs, that people may be reviewing your work even when they know less than you do on some topics. And we need to, but Alba raises, I mean, how do we navigate that situation? So with that, very much like we planned, it is only 11:20. You know that in Fine, we usually take the first hour for the presentation, and then we have another hour for questions and answers. I have blocked, I can stay here for another hour and 40 minutes. But with that, I really just want to open it to the floor. If some of our co-authors who have been cited today, or their readings have been assigned, Valentin, I think he just said he needed to go, but if Claudia or any of you who are co-authors in the papers want to say something, if not, let's open it. Let's open our mics and just because I'm not excellent multitasking, I think, and I have there, it's fantastic. We have 36 people. I cannot have all of you on the same screen. I suggest that you just type a question mark like we always do in Fine. Type a question mark in the chatting, and we will be taking, I'll be calling you as we go. Yeah. So we want to hear from all of you. Can be a question, can be a comment. Any reaction to what just been said? Claudia.
I just have a comment, and I think in your 5-minute presentation, you covered a lot of the topics we could discuss today. But I would like to emphasize also another aspect that is completely related to scientific thinking and the way we are presenting our results, which is stressing the difference between statistical significance and biological significance. I think that is sorely missing in a lot of the papers we read. As an editor, associate editor myself, I am an associate editor at the American Journal of Biological Anthropology. And this relates to what Alba was mentioning, making sure we are slowly, for some, but surely, asking the authors to reflect on that difference, reflect on what do your results really mean for the system you're studying, for our understanding of the biological mechanisms we are presenting in this paper. And yeah, that's my only comment for today.
Please, thank you, Claudia. I totally agree. I think that Kaya was alluding to that when she was discussing effect sizes. The challenge many of us face for the variables we choose to measure, if we just have absolutely no understanding of what a given effect size means for the question at stake. For the table that I showed you, looking at the percentage grooming in TD monkeys in captivity, I have no clue. When does the difference in percentage of grooming between peer mates and strangers becomes an evolutionarily important difference? We have no clue. Then let's say it. Let's entertain, let's speculate and be explicit about it. Remember, just if you want to say something, for me, the easiest, Just type a question mark in the chatting window. I call your name. Ben.
Yeah, I have the impression that there is in biology often a taboo about causality, and maybe this is a way to bring the scientific conversation into the statistics, is that there is, I mean, people rarely talk about causality in their method section. There is causal hypotheses, causal discussion, and then all of the method is associational, and so there is a very loose, implicit, ambiguous link between the quantitative part of an analysis and then the scientific thinking behind. And I think I find it useful sometimes to bring causality into the modeling discussion, because then we have to think, well, of our causal scientific process models into, okay, we have this thinking, we have all of these thoughts, and we're the expert about this. And how do we use this to quantify whatever effect, usually, because we're interested in effects usually. We don't make predictive modeling. And I find the causality discussion, and then, well, looking a little bit in the causal inference existing early framework, a very useful way to bring together the statistical conversation and the scientific modeling part.
I forgot to say, Ben, when you ask a question or make a comment, can you introduce yourself? We continue building the FINE community. If you 2 words saying where you are and what you're doing. And then definitely our colleagues joining us from YouTube, feel free to enter in the chatting the question, or actually if you're in YouTube, I think you do it in YouTube, but we can ask your questions if you're watching us via YouTube. So Ben, can you say where you are, what you're doing, and then we'll take Filippo.
So I'm a PhD student at the DPZ, the German Primate Center in Göttingen, Germany.
Filippo, you're next.
Okay, thank you very much. Filippo Aureli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. And I thank all of you having organized this section. I was one of the ones that pushed Eduardo to do it when this topic came up in maybe in the first, I think the first semester that the FINE round. So I would like to comment a couple of things on my previous commentators, so Claudia and Ben. And I think the 2 things kind of go a bit together, although they were mentioning a bit in a different perspective, is because, you know, the biological significance, if we want to do causation for the biological significance, then Ben is completely correct. We need to have some statistical approach that leads us to doing that. So I think that means probably a little bit more cautious on the interpretation. So the biological significance of results, that we cannot interpret them as causation if we didn't do the methods based on to answer that causation. So, but I agree with Ben that there's a lot of wishy-washy on this part. We have prediction that are directional with a causation effect. We have an analysis that is not, and we have an interpretation and go back to try to interpret this association that we show in the results as some form of causation. And probably a lot of you guys have some comments on this part, but I agree completely on the part on the biological significance, although, as Eduardo mentioned, sometimes it's difficult to know how much of this difference is really biological significant. But that's our task, is in interpreting our results. We should try to get into that point. And this, I think, is not only within this type of conversation of the abandoning the dichotomy, the p-value, but in general, because I think even if we are using a different approach, we still have to get to the biological significance, because that's is the key important part. And my last comment, that was my original comment before I thought, is interesting, and you know, in the papers that we read for this talk and for this session and the presentation that we had, it seems that we feel the shift, you know, towards leaving the dichotomy p-value and moving to some different approach, more with this taking account the uncertainty in our results and explaining those and taking into account all these elements in interpreting our results. But it's slow, of course. And I think some of you mentioned about the fact that it's a tricky balance sometimes to do to still put some emphasis on the p-values to get the paper published, and Alba was mentioning. I just want to share an experience that we possibly got rejected because we didn't do what we are talking about now to do. So the opposite. So we were emphasized too much the p-value, and so I think it's moving in that direction. Probably is a good thing. So if we want to have that, and probably we wrote the paper thinking too much about what Alba was saying, and not finding. So as Eduardo and Claudia in their article say that they are not immune to that system. We went through this system, so we have done the p-value dichotomy in a lot of our previous papers, but in any aspect of my previous paper, when I look at them, I say, okay, that was wrong. I did this modeling completely wrong, and this is wrong. So it's unfortunate because, of course, myself and others will cite these wrong results, but you need to go forward and try to improve what you have done and try to do it better. So that's basically what we need to do. So I thanks for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you.
Thank you so much, Filippo. I think that so much of this is going to be depending on those with power decision, and by that I mean ourselves. The truth is that there is no such thing as the system, right? When Alba was saying, how do I navigate this? The system is you, it's me, is deciding that, okay, if I did it this way 10 years ago, now I change. We were doing genetics with blood types 40 years ago, right? Now we're not doing blood types, we're doing something else. So thank you, because that's what I think we need a lot of that. I mean, I'm even thinking of reanalyzing some of my old published data. What would I learn if I went back to those data and look at them for the data? So the next, we have Adriana, you're next.
Thank you, Eduardo. Adriana Maldonado from Universidad de Rosario in Colombia. Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment on, I think we need to go back to kind of where we start, kind of like how we teach stats to our undergrad students, how we transfer the message to them. So now that I'm teaching sort of a course where I start with like, okay, what is a p-value and what it means to you? What they have in their minds is, oh, I need to get a p-value no matter what, right? And that's what we're teaching them to do. They are just looking for a p-value and nothing else. Or if they are in genetics, perhaps they're just thinking, oh, I don't have anything to do with p-values, I'm just doing Bayesians. But I think we're not kind of making them to think critically about their data and what it means to collect the data and analyze it, how to understand the big picture of the data. And I think that's where we have to start, and then we can move forwards from that point, kind of changing the mind and how we approach our data. And that was my little comment there.
I don't want to take too much time by commenting on what people are saying. So, but I have read a lot about this. So what I'm going to do is just like, for example, I may just write in the chat, and please email me. I'll follow up. I promise I'll send you the files. I'll send you the papers. That's my commitment to you if you're here today. What Adriana is saying was beautifully addressed in another commentary in Science or Nature by two very, very well-known epidemiologists saying that p-values are the tip of the iceberg. And that's what you're saying, Adriana. By the time, to Maren, you're next.
Yeah, I'm Maren Hoek from the University of Derby in the UK. And what I was thinking about follows up on what Adriana just said, because I am teaching currently in first year course in first introduction to statistics now. And I'm torn sort of, because all these ideas of teaching the next generation something new and something better is fine. And we definitely always try to say it's not the p-value. Don't look at the p-value. Think about the biological significance rather than a p-value, and consider if borderline, and don't use it as a black and white system. We try to teach it to them, but it's hard enough as it is. And I don't know how easily they would get overloaded if we tried something else, or if we don't teach them, if we start something completely new, and they don't understand about the old system, would they be able to understand some of the older literature? Would they understand what's going on in the media that still use these old things? So you can't quite avoid teaching the old way. You would need to teach the old way to explain why the new way is better, whatever the new way is really. But this takes so much time, and I don't know which program has enough time, but I mean, in a 3-year bachelor course, you can't teach anything hardly. So definitely not a detailed philosophy of statistics. And it might also depend perhaps on the background of the students that different universities have. But I mean, my university is definitely not the Ivy League and area of universities.
Thank you, Maren. I'll be happy. I couldn't find it as we're talking. I'll share with you a paper that came out on how to design a statistics thinking course that I was telling you about before. Next comes Alba. You're muted.
just a little comment. It is not about p-values itself. Like, p-values are okay if you know what they do and what are the limitations of like your analysis. P-values are good. Like, we have been working with p-values for a long time, and like the stats and the maths under that, they are good. The problem is how we are using them. And the problem is this 0.05, which no one really knows where this came from. And this is now replicating in the other analysis we do too. Like information theory, how is the English? The AIC is not a good solution at all if you are applying the same like mechanisms, like, okay, I'm gonna cut here in 2 delta, or with Bayesian stats is the exact same thing. So it is not p-values. And we are referring to p-values, of course, because this is what we are all doing and we know better. But it is like the idea of thinking that just a single number is going to tell me if my results are valid or not. That is not correct. Just like, let's not like demonize the p-value because it's not just that.
It really would be like a re-emphasis on effect size for each of these cases.
Remember to introduce yourself. Next is Batista.
Hello, everyone. I'm Baptiste. I'm a PhD student at the University of Göttingen in Julia Osner's lab. It's a really nice topic of discussion that you came up with for tonight, and actually reading a bit in advance, I think I found myself almost wondering, what are p-values still telling us? Once we do all the effect size thinking well, and we try to analyze biologically what our difference mean and all this, what would you actually keep the p-value for? What do you, for example, Alba, you were just saying this criteria. I think I agree with all the rest, and I just start to more and more actually wonder, what is it really? Because sometimes the definitions are also counterintuitive. Like, I thought it would tell me how certain I am of whatever effect size I'm measuring. But more and more I read that this is also not the case. And at the end, I feel like, okay, should I just look at the effect size, say, this is my difference, it's meaningful or not? And the p-value, what do you think, how would you define what it's bringing to the picture?
So there's so much literature on all the problems. So if you want to have clarification, any of you want to have clarification on understanding the information contained on a p-value or not, I would definitely suggest that the starting point should be some of the papers published in the American Statistician, Volume 43. I mean, you can read, if some of you with whom we have discussed this, if you can just help me by typing the authors, you can check Hubbard, you can check Wasserstein. Valentin Amrhein, the paper, Valentin will join us on November 8th and to present his paper in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology. And he discusses there 5 misconceptions. That's another starting point. I'll try to say briefly, but one of the things that we need to do, very much like we do with anything we don't know, is we'll have to go and read everything that the experts are saying. I am not an expert. I was telling one of you when somebody wrote to me saying, well, this is going to be the first find where it is expected from us to have a kind of high order mathematical ability. And I said, no way, or I couldn't be leading the meeting, right? As far as, I am not prepared to lead a conversation that requires high order mathematical understanding. So when I think about what are the main problems with trying to find a lot of evidence in the p-value, first is that the p-value by definition is giving you information about the probability of you getting the data based on the hypothesis. So there's a logical flaw in how most people use it. You try to take it as evidence for your hypothesis, which was stated beforehand. What I understand and from my reading is that p-values can be a substantial source of evidence when you have a true experiment of a priori defined effect sizes that you seek. That's why Valentin and Sunderland in the Nature paper talk about in some situations where somebody comes and tell you, listen, we're just going to start pumping sewage water into the lake, and we really need you to tell us what is the difference that you will accept for the increase in some, say, lead, in some poisonous chemical that's going into the water. So I know what the effect size means. It may mean that I don't want to see an increase in so many picograms of this chemical in the lake, right? I can define it a priori. I can set up the conditions, and I really have an experimental situation where I can compare a pre and a post treatment. Add to that even in those situations, some of the suggestions, I think it's Berner and Amrhein in that paper, that one of the problems that people are not even setting up a priori their acceptable error rates, right? You need to be explicit about those. What is the kind of type 1 and type 2 error that I'm going to formulate a priori to delineate my experiment? My understanding is that for the research we do, observational and in nature, very few units on which we make measurements. I'm being very, very thoughtful these days about using the word sample. I believe that we should not be using sample unless we're explicit about the population that we're sampling. Sample size these days doesn't tell me a thing. You need to tell me, I hope to make inferences for this population. This is my sample. That's why I refer on purpose to units of measurement. Those could be people, arms, toes, you name it. But when you have so few units in which you make the measurements, therefore you really have a lot of variation in the measurements you make. When you really have no good understanding of what are the effect sizes that you would like to be able to detect with some probability, because you don't understand what the effect sizes mean, right? Then there's very little value in the p-value. Nobody's saying, if you want, that's what actually one of the things that I always tell people in my group: report it. Give the reviewers everything they want to see because they have not read as much as you have. So there's no damage to reporting it. Very much like Alva said, the damage becomes when you're trying to communicate why your study is important, and in you trying to provide context to your findings, you limit yourself to the p-value. But if you tell me I only measured 8 monkeys, and one was a male, one was a female, their ages were all over the place, you give me context to the data, then that's what we're saying. I think that there's very, very little additional information that comes from from a p-value when you have the systems that most of us deal with. But I'd like to hear from there. I'm sure there may be others who know more than I do, or are better at communicating what I just said. Right, as Tony says, yes, the p-value is the probability of getting the data you observe under a particular null that so many times we don't even take the proper care to, in our methods, define in detail. I don't know if did that help, Batista? Please, my commitment to you, you email me, I promise I'll get back to you with pointers, ideas, information of where you can start reading.
Yeah, I'm more than happy. It was actually helpful just to follow up because, I mean, it was new. Like, of course, the definitions, because of all this reading, I'm actually well aware, but it was really kind of once we know all this, once we know what it means, once we know what it doesn't do, what remains. And I think your point of we have to basically restrict its utility to those very specific cases where we kind of want to verify whether we detected a specific effect size, at least it makes sense to me. And yeah, this is a new contextualization of it too. Thanks.
I open my comments today with examples of what I did in the past. I'll also be happy to share some papers that we have published much more recently, where being much more nuanced on our description of the methods, pages and pages of explaining how and why we build the models we built, right? Pages explaining what the data mean. We have this paper that we're all very proud of, where we measured something about cortisol in monkey poop, trying to infer something about the energetics of biparental care. Talk about hand waving, for crying out loud. And we say it, right? And this was primarily thanks to Claudia, who was the endocrinologist in the team, and kept pushing us for saying, you know what? No, let's bring it down. I mean, let's scale it down. And it's a lot of hand waving. There is progress in that. We should not feel bad about it. Good, solid description of the variation in the metabolite of cortisol in monkey poop. It's a necessary first step. Let's do it. Let's be happy with having made some progress, not hoping to claim that we have actually answered the question. Elijah.
I think Maren might have had a question before me or a comment. I might have been out of order though.
Yeah, and mine was actually directly to Baptiste, or my thoughts on that. I definitely think that just the effect size is not enough, because I mean, I can have one individual and another individual, and there is an effect size, and this can be very large. That doesn't tell us whether there is a biologically meaningful effect size. So the reason why they invented p-values was essentially to help to distinguish between chance and pattern. So is the difference that I have between my two subgroups, is that by chance, or is that something that is potentially biologically meaningful? And the reason why we have p-values is to help with this distinction, whether the p-value is the best thing, and whether it is, I completely agree, this focus, this black and white focus, 0.05 and it's false, or 0.05 and it's true, that is bad. And that is something that is very hard to get out of the beginner's mind, I think, because it's easier. But we need something to check ourselves that we don't, because, I mean, here are quite a few primatologists in the room, and we always have very low sample sizes. And we get overexcited by our results because we might have a big effect size, and this could be a big thing, but it could also be just by chance. And that is exactly why we need a little bit of a check on ourselves that helps us at least to remain critical with how excited we get about it. But also the other way around, we might not find something, as I think it was Kaya who said that that in the beginning it was wavering between being significant, being not significant, because of the low sample size, this might be there is a high effect size, but just depending on things, it doesn't quite reach this arbitrary value. So the effect size is high, and if it is sort of in this context, probably meta-analyses, if they would ever happen in our field, would be very useful, because this could actually help us as well. But again, we have something like a p-value there. But so we need something to make sure that we do not just look at the effect size, but how to best do it. That's the question, I think.
I want to add, Maren, very quickly, because I think it relates very much to what you're saying. It's already been said many times that we have few units on which we measure, and that it's a limitation in primatology. I suspect it's a limitation if you're studying whales or if you're studying mastodons back in the day. Now, that again speaks of the need for nuanced scientific inference. I attended a plenary talk at a primatology meeting where the presenter dismissed 25% difference in mortality rates of dominant and subordinate animals based on a p-value. Now, if you read the literature, how do we make, so if I have that finding, even if I have very little data, but if I have an understanding of the literature outside primatology, and for 100 years we've learned that all kinds of animals that have a 25% decrease in mortality in a year are likely to go extinct. That is another way in which make inference. I can interpret my data in the context of all the knowledge that exists. You don't dismiss a 25% decrease in mortality or increase in mortality if it has been shown from butterflies to bugs and birds that species populations experiencing that go extinct. So you bring that to your discussion. You say, my data are limited, but given everything we know, it looks like we should probably be rather concerned about this. So another way of expanding the scope of our inference by drawing from systems that may have more robust data. So Elijah, thanks for, I missed Maren before, but now it's your turn.
Yeah, something I wanted to add about this discussion and some resources I wanted to share that I will copy in the chat. Something that I think what I've taken away the most, and this is a YouTube video and a paper I'll talk about in a moment, something that I think the biggest misconception I had coming into my training in epidemiology, which very much is, like I said before, kind of accepted that they're going to do something besides just looking at dichotomized p-values, was that it would be still like some type of statistical tool that we use to determine our inference. Like you had said, Maren, it can't just be the effect size and it can't just be the p-value. It has to be something else. And I think these two resources that I shared are really good. The first is from the anthropologist and statistics educator, Richard McElreath. It's a rather long video and you wouldn't have to watch it all at one time, but it goes into all of the things before we even get to statistics. Like, what are the different types of biases and observational data that we're aware of, but how do we actually do something about selection bias? We know that we can have omitted variable bias, is what they might call it, and economics, whenever you leave out a variable that is a confounder, for example, it can bias your results. But there's also a lot of other variables that can bias our results when we include them. And we can mislead ourselves whenever we put stuff in that's related that might not be. It might be a mechanism, for example, and then we might be kind of removing some of that total association. But these two papers, or the talk and then the paper is much shorter, is a really broad overview of those key types of bias. And then Richard McElreath's talk, Science Before Statistics, is kind of getting at this idea that, like I said, was the misconception for me, that the scientific steps are, there's like 5 of them, and then your statistics step is really the 6th. And this is something I'm still having to internalize. Like, one of my committee members is a causal inference epidemiologist and a real expert in this area, and she had to really remind me a lot early on, stop talking about statistics. And her PhD is in statistics, and she was telling me, you're the expert on this, take it slow, catch yourself before you turn to the model and make some type of mistake that needs to be months down the road. First, get your question and make sure you're catching yourself from misleading yourselves. Then you can interpret your effect sizes, or perhaps use the p-value to compare, or for some type of inferential tool. And the other thing I would say is something epidemiologists, especially recently, have been grappling with this idea of meta-analysis, is also thinking about when we compare across studies. A lot of times we just pull the results and the types of models, but each paper could be using a different approach or doing one of these biases that that are mentioned in these papers. So we might have to start thinking more nuanced about meta-analysis as well, and trying to pull papers that took similar approaches or had similar biases, because they might just cancel each other out or lead us into a different direction that might have false confidence, even though it is kind of the state of the literature broadly. Yeah, great resources though, they really helped. I turn to those resources honestly like every month.
Thank you so much, Elijah. We have a question from our colleagues joining us via YouTube. Adriana?
Okay, so this is a question from Luz Carvajal. So it says, if I'm understanding this correctly, is your idea that it is not accessible for us to think of a relevant population for a statistical inference because we work with a very local, very peculiar samples? And this is a question directed to you, Eduardo.
Okay, can you say it again? Is it my idea that we're not supposed to?
That it is not accessible for us to think of a relevant population for a statistical inference because we work with very local, very peculiar samples.
No. I may have miscommunicated my thoughts. I imagine the question, the name of the person, so I can.
Luz?
Luz. I think I assume that Luz's question comes from my comments on how I am trying to force myself to think, talk, and write about sample size. For one thing, more and more in most of our studies, we should probably be discussing, we have many different sample sizes, and I imagine a single paper could have many populations of inference. What I'm saying is that most of us measure whatever we're interested in measure in very few individuals. In fact, precisely because we don't know the population, we couldn't even make the claim that our sample is peculiar, because making a claim about your sample being peculiar would imply that you know the population, and now you're assuming that you just don't know what you have sampled. What I'm saying is that it helps us. I don't even remember who said this. I think that we can take some positive steps in the direction we're proposing by thinking ahead of time, what is my target of inference as a population? Again, some of you have heard me say this many times. Michael Taborski has this beautiful paper, 2008, Taborski, Michael, in ethology, discussing sample size in the study of behavior. So say that I'm interested in measuring owl monkeys, something we have done. We want to explore the extent to which male and female owl monkeys differ in their size or body mass, because we get the impression that they look very much alike, because we have all kinds of interesting evolutionary questions that center around sexual dimorphism in the sexes. And I'm going to go to a tiny little piece of forest, about 100 hectares in Formosa, and hope to capture a few owl monkeys, right? So I'm going to get a few owl monkeys. Actually, we published this in 2011. At the time, we reported data on body mass and size for 23 males, 22 females. What I'm saying is, what do I do with that? What am I really, as a biologist, am I assuming, am I hoping that those data are speaking of possible sex differences in owl monkeys in our 100 hectares, in the whole ranch, in Formosa, in Argentina, in all of Latin America? What is it? But that is a biological question. I mean, because I have expertise on owl monkeys, I no, I don't think that. I'm not trying to make reach conclusions about owl monkeys all the way from Panama to Argentina, that's not my population of inference, because I already know that owl monkeys in Panama are much smaller than the owl monkeys in Argentina. So I use my knowledge of the literature and other people's data to say, okay, I am hoping that my study, my measurement of differences in body mass for owl monkeys can speak to issues that relate to differences in size or body mass of owl monkeys, I would say in the tropics, in the subtropics, I'm sorry, Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay. Why those three countries and not Ecuador? Because I already know that owl monkeys in Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama are very different from the ones in Argentina. So I would not feel comfortable making an inference about the extent of sexual dimorphism in body mass for the whole genus. But all this thinking should go into the a priori study design, because then I can really go to what Baptista was saying. Imagine that now I read the literature enough, which I haven't done, to have an understanding of what is a difference in the size of the femur of an owl monkey, right? That we may begin to speculate is big enough to be saying something about the evolution of the femur in the two sexes. Because I have looked at literature in mice, in birds, I don't know, in fossils. So if I have that, I may decide, oh, gee, I want to be, in fact, we have in this 2011 paper where I think it's the first paper in which I started reporting effect sizes. We have a difference in the size of the forelimb of males and females. I think in that paper, we have effect sizes, we have p-values, and I still don't know what to make of it because there's a half centimeter difference in the mean or median, I don't remember, estimated femur length of males or females. So going to Lucy's question, yes, I will make an inference assuming that most owl monkeys in Formosa probably look like the ones we captured. But I think it helps us to define the scope of those inferences / speculations we want to make. I'm hoping, Luz, email me, Luz, if you like. I hope that I somewhat answered or commented on your question properly. I think that paper that we published, actually, it's just me. American Journal of Physical Anthropology, 2011, Sexual Dimorphism in owl monkeys, has all kinds of interesting angles. What do we do with the differences we find? What does it mean when you find 20 owl monkey males, 20 owl monkey females with some difference? Who's coming next? We took Adriana from YouTube. Could the links be shared again? I lost my connection.
I think Birgit was had a question up higher up. I don't know if she's still here.
Who? I'm sorry.
Birgit Zabo.
Me.
Go ahead, Birgit. I missed it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, don't worry.
Just jump in. Thanks, Kaya, for reminding me. Yeah, Birgit, go.
So I'm Birgit Zabo. I'm a postdoc at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and I have a general comment because it has become shockingly clear to me that it's in the range of the science before statistics that to come up with good questions and to actually then design good studies, you first need to understand your study system. And I find it so shocking how many people, instead of working from the bottom up, jump on top, ask questions, do their stats and infer things that don't even connect to the biology of the specific species that they're testing. It's just like so shocking to me how this is valid. It would stress me out because I would not know how to interpret the results from my data. It's just a comment because I felt like this is something that was said by all of the people that had comments, but not directly. So I thought I pointed out.
Daniel, Berner, and Valentin, their last misconception, their last point in that paper that they suggested we read for November 8th, actually they have a very daring, provocative idea. They're saying, do we really, are we doing should we really be stating that we're examining hypotheses? Why don't we just have questions? And in primatology, he passed, Robert Sussman, was very outspoken about the need for primatology to really go back a few steps and spend a couple more decades on the descriptive stage. And there's a lot of value to that. Sometimes people want to jump on, I mean, we don't have the information that people have on fruit flies. We don't have the information that people have because the people studying fruit flies have studied 1 billion generations and we haven't. So I think there's a lot of value to the idea that, listen, no, I'm just going to describe properly my system for the first 10 years.
And I think that you don't have to stop there. I think that continuing to report descriptive statistics on everything that we do as much as possible really adds a lot. Like, when you read papers and all of the actual information is embedded in their model, and you don't really know, you don't actually get anything that you can compare to other things. I think that there needs to be more continuous natural history.
Now, it does speak to what Alba was saying. Unfortunately, I am not advising Alba to just publish descriptive data. The reason we went for the American Journal of Biological Anthropology with the energetics paper is because we knew we could get a very detailed paper. Now, unfortunately, it saddens me, but I sometimes get the impression that unless you publish in some of these corporate-driven journals with a catchy title that will sell ads in whatever media those journals are advertising, I get the impression that you're more likely to get a job in many places. That's my take on this. It saddens me. Those are the same journals that have decided that what you're asking for, Kaya, has become supplementary. How and when, I don't know. When the methods in science became supplementary, it's a question for our colleagues actually being editors in those journals. And the answer would be, well, but it's expensive to publish the methods. Well, then let's stop publishing those journals. But you're not, I hear you. You're not yet in a situation where you can make take those actions. It should be those of us really deciding where we publish and being editors and reviewers and funding agencies. What I told, things that we have changed, data sharing, ethics. What else has been changed because it was top down? At the very least, now you have to sign a statement confirming that you have your permits for working with the animals. More and more, you have to sign a statement. Then you can lie, but eventually, and there's nothing we can do about it, but it's a step in the right direction. We need something to be top down, saying, listen, unless we understand the units on which you measure, the kind of things you're saying, Kaya, I don't know if it is not top down, I don't think it's going to happen. Elijah was mentioning Richard McElrath. He has this beautiful paper. He's on the fourth author in Proceedings, calling The Natural Selection of Bad Science. I suggest you check it out. There's no incentive. If you ask me, why should I do what you're saying if it takes me longer? If you want to get a job, I say, no, you don't have to. But then you get my age, and I keep feeling like it's easier to convince the reviewers than convince myself of what I've done. And I'm becoming more and more interested in just being convinced myself that I've learned something, not convincing the reviewers, which if you just skim over the methods, then they'll buy it because, it's 25 years. It doesn't matter that the data are all over the place and it's a mess. Who else? I know Tony's writing comments. If you haven't, Tony, we haven't heard from you. Please, Jane, thanks for joining us. Why don't you say your 2 written comments? They seem very relevant. Yeah, there you go, Tony. Tony, if you want to share whatever you're writing, I cannot keep up with reading.
Yeah, they're not profound comments. I just going back to what the null hypothesis is. Defining the null hypothesis in any particular case is super important. And so if your null hypothesis, just in the example that you gave, Eduardo, if your null hypothesis is that there's no difference in some aspect of body size between males and females, that's a particular null. But you could also have a null there's a 10% difference in body size between males and females, or there's a 2% difference in body size between males and females. And so your p-value is just kind of giving you the probability that, right. So starting with the null hypothesis, and one of the other comment is also nothing profound, but descriptive statistics and exploratory data analysis should be what we do from the onset to get a real feel for what your data look like. And that's not anything new. People have been saying that for a really long time.
Talking about the null, that's exactly what I was trying to point at, that you can still, I mean, if you're going to take a frequentist approach and do significance test, null hypothesis exploration, you could really have an informed null, which is what you're saying. I mean, it doesn't need to be null, it's not the same as nil, right? It wasn't for Fisher. So you could say, given everything we know, I'm going to start with a null that is informed by my reading, by data. And given my system, which is something that Birgit was saying, I'm going to set up this. I mean, it's reasonable that I set up this type of type 1, type 2 error. Again, there are more subtleties to that issue that I feel comfortable describing. But I can definitely point the audience to more readings on the topic. But yeah, exploratory data analysis. Well, you and I, Tony, have talked a lot about that, and also we get our students checking the data.
I wrote a question mark, but it's somewhere in the chat, so I'm gonna jump in. No, just following up what Laia was saying about our observation bias, and also what Birgit mentioned about knowing our system. What I found really helpful was this, I put the link in the chat, was this STRANGE framework that ethology published for all of us working with animals. STRANGE is an acronym, is that a word in English? Acronym for social background, self-selection, reading history, habituation, natural changes in responsiveness, and genetic makeup. So trying to respond to yourself these things of your own system usually help you to identify this potential bias in your interpretation when you are doing your interpretation. So since we are saying resources, that's something that we can all benefit from.
The paper that made us learn about strange, Alba, this was a paper led by Alba that we published in Anthology. And again, I know that I'm speaking for Alba. We'd be delighted to share with you not just the paper, but the exchange with reviewers and editors. And that's where those of us being senior in the author line need to be willing to support you in making your case. In writing those letters to the reviewer and the editor saying yes, but, right? And it took us a long time to get ethology to see how there was value in our data set, even with all the limitations. And they asked us, in fact, they asked us to please, that's how we learn about strange. We needed to elaborate on all the limitations the study had. This was a playback experiment in the field. Can you imagine trying to do a playback experiment with our monkeys? I mean, all kinds of limitations we had, but there was something that we thought it was worth sharing. Elijah is next, and then Kaya.
Yeah, one brief comment I wanted to make, still just drawing this contrast between the two fields. I meant not to try to say that epidemiology has it all figured out, but I think one real strength is that there's continually these types of methods papers that are not like telling you how to use methods, but they're illustrating examples of why you might want to think about something a certain way or a certain type of bias. And I'm going to share one of these papers. It's really only 2.5 pages, but I think it's a really great example of work that we could be doing in our fields to take these concepts, but illustrate them, show a common example. This paper walks through examples that anyone in epidemiology could understand to illustrate this type of bias. But I think what we're needing, like these papers come out every other month that are illustrating some new angle for teaching. And I think that this is something that we can do easily. I mean, first we have to make sure I've read and learn how it works, but I think writing about these things and teaching them is the best way to learn ourselves. But having these be more regular type things in our journals, using examples relevant to our subfields, I think is a key thing that's needed, because we have the commentaries about the p-values, but these types of papers are like, okay, what do we do about it? What are the other things outside of this? And one of the best advice I got from an epidemiology methods teacher, he encourages his students to do these. If you, like he says, if you work in a subfield and you've seen that this paper hasn't been written or hasn't been updated in 10 years, do it yourself. It's just 3 pages. You know what people care about. So it's also a way that students can get involved. Because I know a lot of times students feel like a little overwhelmed just trying to navigate and learn these things and weigh the pros and cons, like Alba said, of reviewers. But this can be a way to have that paper that you cite in your own discipline rather than having to cite something from another discipline. And we don't need to recreate the wheel per se, but translate it for ourselves and a common language, I think, is something that's really needed.
You are on, Elijah. You just put yourself.
I know. Yeah, I'm working on one of these for anthropologists, describing an idea like this. Yeah.
Great.
But I would love help with Claudia.
Before I go to Kaya, some of you are leaving. Please, if you want to send me a message directly to me, if you have ideas or thoughts or suggestions for possible future meetings that those of us here may want to do, send them to me. I just learned how to save the chat, so I'm saving the script, but apparently it saves as a text file only, but I may send it to the blind participants, so it's going to lose the active links, but you can, of course, still find the sources. Kaya.
I think there's something to be said about how also to reduce sort of like crap science in the literature and like just like this kind of quantity over quality. And I think one thing that we could do is, and people have different philosophies of this, but maybe resisting sort of laying all the responsibility of like coming up with research question design, et cetera, all the setup on, let's say you have like an undergraduate, thesis student. They don't have the skills, the time and everything to put into one of the hardest things in science, which is coming up with a good question, right? I think that the ideas are something that come much more when you're more senior and when you're more well-read and experienced with the system. And I think one thing can be to give, maybe first-year master's students or undergraduates or whatever you have in terms of very junior scientists that do need to go out and do the science, and then maybe they'll come back and do science on their own a little bit more, and maybe they won't. One thing we can do is kind of give them some options for questions and not make them craft something, and go with a half-baked idea into the field, et cetera. I think that there's a lot of material that is produced sort of that way, and it makes us have to sift through a lot of not great science, and it also is a missed opportunity for us to actually add a real piece of the puzzle.
If we have colleagues still in YouTube, please, if you have a question or a thought you want to share, we can bring it up to everyone. Yes, I agree, Kaya, and Tony agrees as well. One of the challenges, I'm thinking of Magen's comment on courses. One of the challenges that I face is that the structure of the teaching and the courses and the plans for the summer, for example, are not contemplating that we need to move many of the resources and time to before the study. People think that they can just go to the field and then come up with a study. I am talking about undergrads. So something as simple as when they have the deadlines at Yale to submit a proposal for a study needs to be changed. If you want to be communicating to the students, no, you cannot start developing your proposal in March to go do research because you haven't read, you haven't done anything. So everything needs to be moved. But that applies also to my experience with the DDIGs, the NSF grants that students are doing. It speaks of how graduate programs are organized. For me, there's a need to rebalance how much time our colleagues getting started on this need to be spending in the planning as opposed to the executing. People think that research begins with data collection and too much is organized around the idea that most of your energy, time, resources should go to data collection. There is no, I mean, if I told you ask for money so that you can plan, people will look at me and what do you mean? I mean, getting to your plan, talking to the statistician before going to the field. Who does that? How many of you done that? Right? So it is exactly what you're saying, Kaya. Adriana.
I was just going to
we're
comment on
few, so
that.
please feel free to jump in. You don't need to open your microphone and just start talking. Yeah, Adriana.
No, I was just going to say that I wanted to comment on what you just said. I'm implementing sort of that scheme with my undergrads, and they spend 6 months preparing for their proposal beforehand. They have to go over all the methods and how are they going to collect the data, and then I expose them to all the elements they are going to be using. They need to go through the scripts and how are they going to analyze the data. And this semester, I'm making them to actually go and ask for codes to the authors we're following, like in certain technologies that we're using. So they are becoming familiar with the type of data we're going to be using as well. And this semester, I'm also going to take them to the field before they're actually going to collect data so they can sort of test their methods and see if what they're proposing is actually possible. Because that's all the thing. We can prepare everything on the desk and I say, oh, yes, I'm going to do this or that. And I've been there. I've made a whole project out of like sitting on my desk and just like, yay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to put these misnets and over this and there. And then I got to the field and I was like, oh my goodness, a misnet is not going to work here. At least not the one I have or the one I bought. And so I think, I mean, probably, and this might be a difference between undergrads in the US or undergrads in Europe and undergrads here in South America. Our undergrad students, they go, when they actually do research, they go through a process in which they have to write it up and then do their the report, or they can actually publish that, indeed. So I think it's Kaya's point and then yours, Eduardo, it's a really important point for them to actually develop critical skills, critical thinking skills on how to do science.
There's a guy, I think his name begins, I'm awful with names, but one of the papers published in this American Statistician volume, Adriana speaks of the need for considering the possibility that we may publish those studies that your students are developing, regardless of the data they get. So there's this person, I don't remember if it is a he or she, pushing for this idea, I don't think I want to see it in my lifetime, that really the study should be judged and published or not without need to look at the data, because you have no control of if your methods, if your design and your execution meet the criteria that we want to set up for good science. I have no control over where the owl monkeys are going to reply or not. I have no control of where the vaccine is going to work or not. Right, it's a kind of that's what it's a radical idea, but it's speaking to the importance. It's speaking to rebalancing the importance of study design. Again, I mentioned the paper by Leek and Peng, the p-values being the tip of the iceberg, is rebalancing the attention to everything that comes before you actually collect data. Do we have anyone?
So I think what you're saying is going along the lines of pre-registration, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right, you're right. And that's going to become, I mean, has it been the case that it's becoming mandatory in some way? I mean, are we seeing, talking about the top-down decisions, are we seeing pre-registration now? But it could happen. I imagine in research that there's a lot of money, both in the cost of doing the research and potential consequences because of that people will say, you must pre-register. Batista, feel free to jump in. Where are you? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to bounce back on what was just discussed, because I think it's interesting that, of course, we come from this ecology, behavior, like super messy data sets. But especially with the material you sent up front, it was very obvious, and actually leaking through papers, that even fields that are very structured, controlled, like neuroscience or infectiology, because you just mentioned COVID, that ticked to me, they're facing the same problems. And so, and it links to this question of, even when we register or we design well, there is this power question, for example, and even studies that are like pre-registering everything. Now with our GLMNs, we're not even really capable of calculating our power pre-study. I mean, we have a great statistician here at the in-house at the DPZ and the uni. And when I show him my models, he tells me, I don't have a clue. Like, no one has a clue about your power. Not only because we are unsure about the effect size that we're looking for, but we have so many random terms in our like GLMNs. And so basically this is gone. And of course I can accept that in my messy field it's gone, but it feels like we're definitely not the only one, because yeah, this 2013 paper for neuroscience was kind of finding a power between 8% and 30% in normal like MRI studies. And so even if we do all this very thoughtful thinking and planning, how do we still make sure that we're not just doing exactly what we were doing before, because we are underpowered and we are maybe, you know, not really improving the science we do? And I just, at the moment, I have no idea, I have no answer, but I was just very baffled by the fact that even powerful field, very controlled experiment are facing very similar problems.
Maybe what we need to start doing is acknowledging that there's nothing. You say, how do we make sure? Well, you just don't. There's nothing that you're sure. I mean, if we're all biologists by training, maybe what we really need to start, we know at the bottom of our heart, we understand the complexity of living systems. We understand, actually, we are talking all the time about how every single individual is different from the other. But then suddenly we hope that that our study will be the exception to the rule, and things are going to be sure. And I'm going to go to statistics. I didn't mention this, but it's something that I've been saying a lot in the last few weeks, because I asked the chair of the statistics department, I asked him, how do you define statistics? We're going to statistics for certainty. Statistics is the science of qualifying uncertainty. Statistics is the science of qualifying variation, probability. There's not a word in the definition of statistics that speaks of being sure or being certain or all or none. And we go to them for something they cannot give us, because that's not what they do. So now I cannot help think, but I cannot stop thinking about Alba. How do we change that if you don't have the title of your paper making, I mean, the kind of title that apparently the news outlets want to see? How do we make the change that people will accept your study for what it is? Because it's well designed, it's thorough, it's replicable because the methods are there, and no, you're not bringing closure to any single topic. It's almost a philosophical question. I'm feeling so much more comfortable accepting the uncertainty that comes with what I do. Will the reviewer see that way? That I don't know. But Filippo, I think Filippo had some good comments.
Yeah,
that it's changing.
Yeah,
Filippo, you're there.
Yeah. On this issue, I think, you know, until now we were pushing, or you were pushing especially, to a change on the moving from the dichotomy, significant or significant to other things. Now you're doing another one to change on the sexy title. So I think that can be done, because then becomes popular, becomes the key is the one as the philosophical approach and as the descriptive. So it's just a matter of pushing in that direction. The other one is because you have to sell it to the one that don't know, because the title often is too push, that is not reflecting the results in a lot of this stuff. Instead, there's going to be a change, and that could be done if there is, again, movement towards that, actually the title reflects much more the content of the study, reflects the uncertainty within the results, and then so is an accurate description of what the study have found. So I think it's possible. It just is a slow process, but it can be done. So I don't think that I think it's a good idea. I think that should be changed, because often you feel like, okay, now let's come up with a sexy title. I found this now. What is it? Why should I do that? I can tell you something just for fun, but I don't need to come up with a sexy title for people reading my paper. And that's an important thing. So. So I think if we do the bigger thing, we can do also these smaller things, because this is more like almost a cosmetic issue.
I mean, anytime we talk about funny titles, I was at an NSF panel many years ago, and the program officer, no, he wasn't the program officer, it was kind of a top officer of NSF. They always come and talk to you, and they were telling us how, listen, guys, you may think it's cute, but it really creates all kinds of problems when you have a title like shrimp on a treadmill. And if you just copy and paste those words in YouTube, you'll find the shrimp on a treadmill. Because then you have people who, of course, want to make challenge. I mean, this was the situation that arose out of this paper, and some Congress representatives saying, what the heck are we doing studying shrimp on a treadmill? Of course, those representatives can barely read, much less read the paper and understand that it was really getting at some very, very cellular specific mechanisms of energetics in a system where you can do it. But I always remember the title of this paper, Shrimp on a Treadmill, and it's funny. I mean, you really look, go to YouTube and you'll see the little shrimp running on the treadmill, and our colleagues getting all kinds of energetic measurements on the shrimp. Yeah. Can we, and before you keep going, can we look forward? Can you help us with ideas of things that we may want to do, be another conversation, or with some of you, I am talking and thinking about getting some way of training, workshops, or do you have suggestions of things that, and the challenge we face with Claudia, we've discussed this with Claudia a lot, is identifying the audience for whatever we want to do. We keep walking in circles, and one day we wake up and we actually did organize a workshop for grad students, and not one of them applied. That's a challenge. I mean, students don't, yes, Tony, not one. When we did NEEP, this is a local regional evolutionary primatology meeting. We organized a conference in 2016-17 at Yale, and we offered all expenses paid to have grad students join us the day before for a meeting, a workshop on these issues. And we didn't get one application. Make of that whatever, I mean, we can make all kinds of things out of it. But one option is, and that's why I invited Alba, Kaya, and Elijah, because I really think that I'm energized by talking to those of you who are going to be leading the field in the next many decades. But unless we get reviewer, but you're not deciding on the grants, you're not deciding on what gets published yet. So then we thought, okay, why don't we do something with colleagues who are really making decisions in funding agencies, in journals? I want to hear from you. Thoughts?
I think both are. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, people. No, okay.
I think. Go ahead, Alba, is you.
No, what I would propose for us, because we also have responsibility of what we are doing. It's not all reviewers and not all editors. Like, we need to take responsibility about the kind of analysis and interpretations we do. So for us, young scholars, for us, I have some suggestions, but we have mentioned them already during the talk. But of course, embrace this uncertainty. Like, there's no way we are gonna be sure that what we are doing is like the absolute truth. And we need to report that. It's just not like I am fine knowing that I don't have an absolute truth. Is that I'm gonna report as many, as explicit as I can, all my steps and all the numbers I got during my analysis. Also, more open data and transparency, which now for some journals, I think it's becoming mandatory, not the pre-registration, but just the data setting part is become mandatory to share your data, or at least like do a little statement about how you are gonna deal with that. And then for you, well, I think you should like bring your own, you like senior PIs, you should bring your own ideas, but it could be very, very helpful for us to have like engaged editors and reviewers in these topics, and to don't dismiss these negative results, which are solely based on I don't have a p-value less than 0.05. Like there is value also in these descriptive and even not statistical significant studies we do, because as someone mentioned, I don't remember who was, it is expected for us to discover a whole new thing every time we publish a paper. And that's not how science, at least in our field, that's not how science works. So we will like be putting little pieces on this big puzzle, and these little pieces don't need to be statistically significant. That's for us.
So something concrete that we could do is just come up with examples of how we have now written methods and discussions of studies that were very limited in some of the things we've discussed. And one could even imagine having a little workshop on how you, if some of you found yourself at the stage where trying to write this up, and again, inviting the modesty and the humbleness of saying, guys, this is what I am, and have workshops, the same way that Elijah shared some examples of, for trying to understand a collider, maybe really sharing examples of how we're trying to write now, our methods and discussions. I'm going to skip you, Filippo, because Birgit has asked your questions. Then Birgit first, then we go Filippo and Adriana.
Thanks. I just have a comment, or speaking from what I do personally, to make sure that my papers are, you know, neither over nor under interpreting, and that I understand my study system and what my data tell me, is I try really thoroughly to design and to think of my questions that is related to my study species. I design an experiment trying to talk to many colleagues to give me input, because one person can never think of everything. I also try to reproduce my studies in-house. So I do sometimes the same methods multiple times, either on the same individuals with a lot of time in between, or a new cohort, see if I get the same results, see if they behave similarly under similar circumstances. Of course, reproducing studies across different labs is better, but sometimes we don't have the opportunity. I work with lizards. I am the only one working with my species. I cannot ask someone else to reproduce my results. There's nobody. And I'm also trying to change the way I report my results. I started using different language. When I report p-values, I try to report estimates, confidence intervals, p-value. I really try to report a whole set of measurements or test statistics, just to give like the best possible understanding of what I do. I also publish all my raw data. And here I want to say, please think about raw data is. I'm also doing meta-analysis. I get frustrated with people publishing what is raw data when it's actually a summary table. This is not raw data, people. I get really annoyed. I even once saw, when I reviewed a paper, that they provided a summary table, but their statistics were on the raw data. So with that table, you couldn't even reproduce their stats. It was like, no, this is not how we do it. And I also publish my code with the data, which means that with the raw data set I provide and the code, you can completely, from top to bottom, run my whole analysis yourself. And I always encourage reviewers to look at these. I provide links in my papers to the raw data, so like view-only links, anonymized, so that reviewers have the opportunity to do so. I personally do this if I have the access to data and code. I run people's code. If I find something, I will tell them this is an issue. Please check your model assumptions, whatever. I go and I tell people, but it's some more work, of course, in the review process, but I do try to do a thorough job. Yeah, and I hope with all of these kinds of, safeguards that at least what I publish is to my current standard, like the highest I can do. I mean, I'm learning, I'm constantly learning, I'm constantly improving. It's what we do. But yeah, this is what I do. I don't know if this is helpful, but.
No, it's very interesting, very helpful, Birgit. Filippo?
Yeah, okay. I wanted to kind of comment on the first bit on what Eduardo mentioned about you try to run this course and nobody showed up and so on. And I think it is surprising because certainly there's a lot of interest. So maybe the format was not the right thing. And so I wonder if since there's a lot of material, and you mentioned maybe it's good to put things out, is to have tutorials for all sorts of things. For running an undergraduate course in statistics, I mean, I was looking at the Steele et al. Paper that described the course that they ran. This seems of statistical thinking. This seems very good, but of course we cannot access to the course because maybe engaging people to have material that actually can be shared, and you form in this way a community broad, because each of us then will teach this part in our own ways, but involving people, because now the good things we learned during the pandemic that we can do things like this, so we can get people, because I think Bridget was saying that it was good to discuss their own idea with different people. So even in a course, coming up with different people telling the same story, quotation mark, becomes not the same story. You see the variation on that. And the same, maybe there could be tutorials on this broader view with examples and so on for more senior people, so not the one that take the course, but the one that give the course, and they are reviewers often, although a lot of the people here are also reviewers as well, but maybe not final decision making on the editorial board. But so there could be tutorials that are not linked necessarily to tutorial material, let's say, that can be done at the different stages with examples like you were suggesting, because it looked like to me that they could be very useful for different. And I think there is plenty of room to do it. And the good stuff, although this idea of the course and with a free trip to Yale and so on didn't work, I don't think to stop. I think it was a great idea, and maybe just the format should be done differently. And I don't know, I'm suggesting tutorial that can be available on the internet so everybody can use it, or in a different format. But I think it's a great idea to keep doing these things and sharing examples, because I think with example, the theory that we are thinking it becomes much more realistic and understandable. So the collides example that we shared before, I think is a great things to see. But I finished with the comment with Bridget about the meta-analysis things. I do meta-analysis, but I also don't put all the raw data, especially how they got this raw data. So I think that's another discussion for a different time, because how this data got is a different issue. And I know that a lot of people like Bridget get angry about that, but I have an issue on that.
So Virginia, it's Adriana next, and Nelson. You wrote a comment. So Adriana,
should I read Nelson's comments, Eduardo? Because he said that he thinks it's important a workshop of behavioral ecology, including theoretical basis, field trip to collect data and analyze data, like the courses from TBA, that would give important basis for undergrad students, which I think.
For those who don't know, TBA, I'm assuming, is the Tropical Biological Association that he's referring to some of these courses. Yeah. So, Kaya, thank you, Eugenia, for joining us. And then Josh, thanks for joining us as well. They're leaving, but Kaya is next, and then Batista.
Sorry, I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. Can Baptiste go first, and then I'll go
Batista,
after?
go first, yeah.
I'll give you 1 minute, but I'll be short. Just to add to the practicality. So I'm also at the moment like writing results, and something I'm actually trying is, so I was already translating any estimate into the biological scale of whatever I'm measuring. But now, and I actually don't know if it's even a good idea statistically, but I'm starting also to do it with the confidence interval. Meaning like, yes, our estimate, mean average point estimate, this beta coefficient, is what we usually see. It's my effect size. But actually my effect size is not perfectly as likely to be anywhere in my confidence interval, but it's very likely that my real effect size is somewhere in this confidence interval. And so if I, to some extent, only always translate back for the reader to understand finally what I'm looking at, my best mean estimate, I'm also kind of biasing towards a rather strong effect size. Like it's the mean one, but if my confidence interval is quite far, it might still be significant. But let's say I'm looking at how many friends my monkey has when it's in the mating season against the non-mating season. If the difference between those two things is less than 1 friend, because my low border of the confidence interval is close to 0, it's not as 0, but it's less than 1 friend. What am I saying? Like there is less than 1 friend. What is less than 1 monkey? It's nothing. It's not actually a thing. And so my mean estimate might be that there is a 1.5 or even 1.8 difference in the number of friends, which starts to be like, okay, it's 1 friend, it's 2 friends, maybe it's, but if my low boundary is less than 1 and getting close and close to 0, here again, I think I start to give my reader a tiny bit more of you measure a difference, but you know, no one will see, the monkey will not know. And there was a very recent paper on menstruation differences following COVID boost. And it's exactly this kind of similar thing. You might have an average that is slightly above a day of difference. The breadth was as informative, saying, okay, we will have many women that won't see a difference because we are below a day. On a population level, we do catch it. There is an effect. On an individual level, for example, many patients will not notice it. And then we can even say, but we have a high confidence interval that is at 2.5 days. And again, looking back to the literature, 2.5 days might be, for some other reason, a very biologically meaningful or stressful, in a case of like menstruation delay, estimate for actual real people. And then I think by actually saying what the confidence interval mean and not just our estimate, we can also start to maybe give this finer understanding. So that was just one thing for the estimate. For the other thing, very quickly on your trial, Eduardo, for the course, I was wondering, do you think maybe we should have, for undergrads especially, courses that are just about designing a study, and actually they don't really need stats. They go to the field and they can look whether males and females lizards are dimorphic. Just let's ask the student to show whether they are dimorphic just with data. And whether they need to put a p-value on this, they can figure this out during their masters. Because I would say if they're able to very accurately write a report, their bachelor thesis or whatever, without a single p-value or t-test, but just showing data and analyzing what they see, once they understand that we need to check for the homogeneous of variance and all this crap, then they can put an extra little test, but maybe we need a complete split. There is data collection and studies design. And once we are good at this, we can do a bit of stats.
Oh, I agree. I mean, try this. This is an exercise I've done a lot in my teaching of, I don't teach statistics because I'm not prepared to teach statistics, but more and more I'm teaching statistical thinking and scientific thinking and reasoning. And this is an exercise I've done a lot. You just select a few students in your classroom and make them stand in the front. You're kind of anticipating, you're choosing them so that there are differences in their height. In fact, there are always differences. I mean, I could choose people with my closed eyes and there will still be differences. But then if the students know that you're trying to get at a conversation about inference, ask them, is there a difference in the height among these people? And some students will tell you no. And you're looking at the people and say, and then you say, what do you mean they're, I mean, you can see that their heights are different, but they cannot focus on the actual evidence. Automatically, dogmatically, I would say, they're trying to make an inference, which is not what you're asking them. So you cannot even, that's the first step of what you're saying. We need to get them to look at the data for the data. They've lost that because, as Adriana was saying, or who was saying, that they just want to get a p-value. So yes, I think that in institutions like mine, and this is the kind of conversation I'm having, we need, not every student needs to take Stats 101. I think it's much more important that they take Science 101. But Science 101, it's not being taught. At Yale, we don't have a basic course so that our fellow citizens can open the newspaper and make sense of the quantitative news. What we have is that every undergrad needs to take some, and if it is quantitative reasoning, it ends up being the recipe that Kaya was describing that she took when she was an undergrad. I don't think we're training them in research methods. In fact, when I discussed this with my colleagues, not my colleagues at Yale, somewhere else, a little bit of opinions, well, but people pick up methods through the research, working in the lab, yes, maybe, but if this is so important, why don't we make them take formal courses? Political scientists are doing it, sociologists are doing, economists. So I agree we need those courses. Batista, Adriana, you come next, or you've already?
I remember what I was going to say. It'll be quick because it also builds off of, it was a similar point actually to what Baptiste said, and actually Birgit alluded to it too, but just to reframe it a little bit, I think that we do have a lot of control of what language we use to describe our conclusions. And so even if p equals 0.05, I mean, we can, or less than that, we can choose actually to take that statistic out if it confuses the story. But if even if the reviewers insist, you can say, you know, it was a statistical difference, but like extremely slight, negligible, blah, 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 and tell your story and take control of the story if you can see that it's really not biologically meaningful. One example is that I was recently doing an analysis to see if the slope of my data differed from a one-to-one line. And there was a lot of data, but the slope was like 0.0978. And because it was a lot of data, it was significant. And I'm either going to take the p-value out, or I'm just going to say it like differed negligibly. And that's my story, you know? So I think the language that we use, or like not very different, all that kind of stuff, we can take control of that. And we can push back if a reviewer is saying, no, it was, you know, I think we need to push back.
Cite. You push back. The first step in pushing back, this is always, Alba has done it, cite references, because then it's new. The same way that the reviewers want you to cite references for why you're doing the genetics methods you're doing, so it's not you're not pushing back. In reporting my data, I am following the suggestions by the American Statistical Association, blah, blah, blah. In interpreting my data, I am following this and that. And if you really want to anticipate the situation, and try to find papers that were published in Proceedings, Nature, PNAS, blah, blah, blah. And so the reviewer, at the very least, will have to challenge your following of methods that you claim by references some other people have suggested. So preempt that. Don't wait for the reviewer to raise the issues. That in following the exponential growing literature and all this, I'm reporting fully the p-values, and I'm interpreting my findings based on the relevance, blah, blah, blah. Do it before you get the reviewers, because it's much harder to get people to change their minds than accept your ideas, right? Than challenge your ideas. This has been fantastic. We're getting to the hour, the 2 hour. I mean, we have had as many people joining us today as we've been doing for any of our talks. I cannot thank you enough, especially, and some of you are still here, Claudia, because we've been discussing with her these issues again and again for years. I mean, Filippo, we did publish the first paper on meta-analysis with Claudia the first paper ever in conservation biology. Elijah, Kaya, Alba, thanks for joining me in this idea. Tony, Tony and Megan, we've been discussing with you guys for so many years these issues. I have no doubts that a lot is going to come out of this. Actually, so much that we may need to identify some common ground, because there are ideas all over the place, and maybe we can try to see how we converge on some ideas that we feel, okay, let's go there, right? I can imagine having a group where we share and discuss how we're writing up the results, Batista. And now, again, that's another way when you acknowledge or versions of this manuscript were reviewed by blah, blah, blah. The commentary, you can check with the commentary that we got published. We share with my colleagues, Nicole Lazar and Ron Wasserstein, who are the ones who published the guidelines on p-values. So those are things that, okay, Eduardo wrote this commentary, but Eduardo and Claudia were not doing it on their own. They kind of had people who seem to know a thing or two about p-values checking on the commentary. So thanks to all of you. I think that with that, we're gonna say bye to next week to our community in YouTube. It's been a long meeting, but fantastic one. I'm gonna stop the live stream.